Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Does the death of Osama bin Laden mean America is safer? Where does the U.S. war on terrorism stand? Coming up, we talk about the world after bin Laden. Stay tuned. Dialogue is next. Hello, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us here on Idaho Public Television, on the World Wide Web, and on public radio stations. Justice has been done. That's what President Obama said after he announced the death of Osama bin Laden. In the days since, intelligence agents have been sifting through material seized during the raid on the compound of bin Laden's compound, and policy experts have been debating the true impact of his demise. Are we safer now than we were a few days ago? How does this impact U.S. foreign policy? And what is the world like after bin Laden? Joining me now to discuss these are three guests. In our Moscow studio is Bill Smith, the director of the Martin Institute and the Martin School of International Studies at the University of Idaho. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
In our Pocatello studio is Sean Anderson, professor of political science and director of the International Studies program at Idaho State University. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
A pleasure to be here.
And in our Boise studio is Greg Raymond, the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University. Thank you for being here. And of course, we want you to join the conversation. Give us a call, toll free at 1-800-973-9800. Well, gentlemen, let me throw the first question, and I'll start with you, Dr. Raymond. What is the significance of bin Laden's death?
Well, I think it's significant on many levels. At one level, it's significant in that bin Laden was an important symbol of al-Qaeda. And with him being gone, there's a certain glue that's missing from the organization. At another level, it brings, I think, closure for a lot of people who'd suffered from the multiple terrorist attacks that occurred during the time that he was leading the organization. But beyond that, there's even a more significant level, and that is the intelligence that we apparently have gathered from the materials that were collected from the compound that evening.
Dr. Anderson, what do you think of the significance of bin Laden's death?
Well, in addition, it appears that from what they're learning now is that, contrary to what many people believed, he actually was very involved in the actual operations, not just in the central organization, but some of the branches. You know, there was consultations or directions between al-Qaeda Central and, say, the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And many people said, well, you know, operationally it was less significant because he was more in the background. He was almost purely a symbolic leader, and apparently that's not true.
And Dr. Smith, what do you think?
Well, you know, we have a tendency in the United States in policy issues to add sort of militaristic monikers to the title. So the war on terror is an awkward construct because, you know, in a war you're used to having defined victories. You know, you take a hill, you take a city, you have an important battle, and you win. And we don't have a lot of those over the last 10 years. And so having a definite thing that we as the American public can look to, or people fighting the war can look to as a win, is an important psychological component to this.
We've had a few days since the raid on the compound. Have we learned anything significant from the material we found in there?
Well, I think one thing we've learned is some of the things we believed have turned out not to be true, such as, which was just mentioned, that bin Laden had much more operational control than we imagined that he did. We've learned minor details as well. For example, there was the long-standing rumor about kidney problems and being on dialysis. Well, among the things we scooped up were his medicines. None of them had anything to do with a kidney problem.
Dr. Anderson?
Well, that also was a surprise to me because I'd heard that he had a kidney condition, they had to have dialysis, and I always thought, well, that would make him, you know, less able to move around. But similarly with Ayatollah Khomeini, you know, there was the report that he'd had the heart attack, and that necessitated his move from Qom to Tehran. And that was purely a cover story. That was, you know, disinformation. So the kidney dialysis thing probably was a deliberate disinformation.
And Dr. Smith?
I think the funnest thing we've learned is that there's going to be a lot of stuff to learn from the materials collected for months and years to come that we didn't know what all we had. You know, the operation was a risk, not just a risk in terms of whether he was there or not, or that something would go wrong. So for things to have gone the way the administration hoped, and for there to be a great intelligence benefit from this is really striking.
Well, how big a risk did President Obama take in authorizing this operation?
Some of that will depend on how old you are and whether you were paying attention when Jimmy Carter tried to rescue the hostages once upon a time, and see that there were already problems with his presidency. But that image of the downed helicopters in the desert and knowing that we couldn't rescue them, followed closely thereon by Ross Perot and his gang doing a private raid to help get some people out. It was a big juxtaposition and really sort of sealed an unfortunate legacy for President Carter. That's the risk that Obama took.
Apparently,
if I may jump in?
Sure.
Well, suppose if our intelligence were off slightly and we'd hit the wrong compound, or we ended up killing a bunch of civilians or bystanders in the process. The political fallout with Pakistan, the Muslim world, and then failed to actually get him. I mean, then that was one of the risks he had to face. And we still face repercussions in terms of our relations with Pakistan, because technically we violated their sovereignty.
Apparently, there was a deliberation that took place over what way to approach this. One was the raid, which actually took place, but another option would be to call in airstrikes. That would certainly not place U.S. troops in immediate risk, but it created other possible risks that the president believed were too great. For example, collateral damage if you call in a B-2 airstrike. Would you be able to verify the body of bin Laden if you called in such an airstrike? The diplomatic fallout probably would have been much greater with a large airstrike. And the possibility of Pakistani air defenses being alerted to an incursion into their airspace. So it was risky to go in the way we did, but when you weigh it against the other possible option that they looked at, perhaps it was a better choice. Still, it was a gutsy choice.
The pictures that we've got up now show the president and his cabinet, or the National Defense Council, watching. The technology is pretty amazing that they could get real-time information back from the raid. I can't imagine what it was like in that room.
Right. So the old version that we used to get on spy movies and stuff would be that the satellites could provide you with that real-time image, but the satellites actually only work for a few minutes each day as they fly directly over. So it's the drone technology that really gives you the direct, constant access to a site. Flying a drone at a high enough level, they can't be spotted, but it's got the technology to follow this in real time.
Let's get to our first caller, Glenn in Chalice. Glenn.
Hi, Joan.
Hi.
I was just wondering, on your guest's opinions, will Al-Qaeda disband now that bin Laden is dead?
Okay, that's a good question, Glenn. Let's pass it through. Gentlemen, let me toss it out to you. Does this mean the demise of Al-Qaeda?
Oh, certainly not. One way to think about Al-Qaeda is to think of it as first a core group of people around bin Laden himself. But then you have the various affiliates, the franchises that are decentralized and able to conduct operations on their own. And then finally you have what could be called the wannabes, the lone wolves who are inspired by someone like bin Laden. So you take bin Laden out, you take out about a third of the major people in that core through drone strikes, you still have intact the various franchises scattered about, as well as the wannabes.
Is it like the arms of an octopus?
Well, some people have compared it to the mythical Greek Hydra.
Okay.
That you chop off one head, there's still a lot to worry about.
Dr. Smith, is that
So
a
one of the things we haven't
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one of the things we haven't talked much about is how this impacts the fundraising branch of al-Qaeda. The leadership aspect is one that's diffused, but if a lot of the money came through bin Laden and his contacts, then it definitely does have an impact. Now, we're certainly not going to see the complete demise of al-Qaeda. That decentralization is key, but to have the money to carry out and the expertise to carry out sophisticated high-level attacks like the one we saw in 9/11, that one may have been impacted more than a day-to-day operational sense.
And Dr. Anderson.
Oh, well, I think that the various franchises will continue to operate. In some ways, it's going to be like hunting down the last Japanese soldiers that fought as long as until after 1985 in the Philippines. Is that some of these groups will continue to try to carry out the mandate. I think what you have to understand with al-Qaeda is that we are progress oriented. We think in terms of you have certain objectives, goals, they're measurable. This is very much faith-driven. Is that if you're following the mandate of Allah, you're following His commandments, victory is assured, whether you live or die, whether you have a particular victory or not. In a sense, just like the Japanese soldiers who didn't receive the orders to stand down, they continued to carry out those orders until either they were killed or some aging sergeant came in in an imperial uniform with a bullhorn and said, Sergeant Oneida, the emperor orders you to stand down. So, we're still good, but their capacity is definitely diminished.
Let me ask this question about U.S.-Pakistani relationships. How will this change our relationship with that? Let's start with you, Dr. Smith.
Boy, that's about as complex a question as I think we have going right now. We didn't really understand, and don't think we really understand how fragile the relationship was before the raid happened last week. How it's going to play out in the future is also something we're going to have to watch carefully. There's not really a Pakistan. There is a United States, one part of our administration you can deal with directly and sort of set your policy towards the administration. Pakistan, there's more than one Pakistan, and whether we're working with elements in the Army, elements in the ISI, or elements in the elected leadership, that's a complicated thing.
Dr. Anderson.
Well, that's correct. The problem that you have with the ISI is that certain elements with it, they collaborated a long time with the Taliban, with Afghan groups resisting the Soviets, and they developed strong personal ties, and so certain elements have very strong sympathies towards the Taliban and towards al-Qaeda. And the split between the government, the civilian government, the military and the ISI was illustrated after the attacks on Mumbai, is that the Prime Minister told the head of the ISI is that the Prime Minister of Pakistan told the head of the ISI, you have to go to India to talk to the Prime Minister of India to assure him that Pakistan was not involved in these attacks. And his answer to the elected head of government was, I don't answer to the Prime Minister of India. Well, apparently he didn't answer the Prime Minister of his own country, Pakistan, either.
Well, I think we have an acid test that'll be apparent very soon. We took a lot of material out of that compound, but we didn't get all of it. We went into his office and took out flash drives and apparently a diary, but in other rooms there were other piles of documents. Pakistanis now have those documents. We've asked that they share that intelligence. This will be a quick test to see how our relations are. Also, you have to wonder, will they share all of the intelligence that they may have? So I think these are some crucial questions.
It does seem hard to believe that no one in the Pakistani government knew that bin Laden was in that compound, considering it was not that far from what would be the equivalent of our West Point. It's hard to believe. Do you believe that the Pakistani government or officials that are in the government helped bin Laden?
I could easily imagine that there is a faction within the military, within the intelligence structure of Pakistan that knew about this. I could also imagine that there are political officials in Pakistan who didn't know about it. So I think it's not an either-or. Either Pakistan knew or they didn't know, but rather any regime is made up of coalitions, of bureaucracies and departments, and And often these departments are involved in political struggles with one another, and they each define Pakistani national interest in a different way. And so I could easily see how there would be a faction in Pakistan that was complicit in this. But at the same time, there are other groups within Pakistan which did not know.
Dr. Smith, the members of Congress have been making noise about cutting our foreign aid to Pakistan. What do you think of that?
I don't think we should do anything in a knee-jerk reaction. You ask whether whether I would believe that no one could know. It's plausible that no one could know, and I think a better panelist for this kind of question would be a sheriff or somebody. I mean, we all live in because you know, think about your neighborhood and who you know and who you don't know, and even folks who live in a nicer, more distinguished-looking house or a compound with a wall that you know. I mean, we don't pay much attention to these things. Whether the sheriff would know who those folks were is really the question I'd want to ask. But Congress, you know, when they make statements like these, they may be making separate statements inside the intelligence committees and the defense committees than they're making vocally to their public, right? You have to kind of gauge who a politician is speaking to when they speak. And I think most of those are designed for us, their constituents, as opposed to their colleagues or foreign policy experts.
Dr. Anderson, what do you think about U.S.-Pakistani relationship and how this impacts?
Well, it's always, you know, the Pakistani government, you know, and I think the point that Greg made is very good, is that it's hard to talk about one unified Pakistani government. There's, you know, the different, you know, the military, the ISI. They're between a rock and a hard place. You know, popular sentiment is you know, a good deal of popular sentiment in Pakistan and the Muslim world is supportive of jihadists. And so to the extent that they cooperate with us, they're cooperating with people that many Muslims regard as the enemies of Islam. You know, they have to consider, you know, their national security interests and popular opinion. The other thing, too, is that what's the practical alternative to us continuing to support Pakistan? To cut off aid, to cut off relations? That might actually push Pakistan into the hands of extreme Islamists that would even be worse to deal with than Al-Qaeda, you know, because Pakistan is a nuclear state.
Yeah, that's a big difference to understand it's a nuclear state.
I'd like to amplify that point because there are still top Al-Qaeda people, presumably somewhere in Pakistan. We're going to need some type of relationship in order to continue our search for them. Plus, Pakistan is a place where so many problems seem to be coming together. As was just mentioned, it's a nuclear state. It has, by one estimate, 110 nuclear weapons. It's also a weak state, that it doesn't exert control over certain areas, most notably the mountainous tribal areas. It's a state that's going through tremendous economic problems. There's a fuel crisis. There's a food crisis. Inflation's been hovering around 20%. And on top of that, it's experiencing what we call a youth bulge. It has a large number of very young, educated, unemployed youths who, statistically speaking, that correlates highly with the possibility of unrest. And finally, it's a country, I think now has about 170 million people. In 20 years, it's projected to be somewhere around 250 million people. So we can't ignore it.
Oh. Now, today the Afghan government extended an agreement with the Indian government. They started a strategic development joint thing. How is that going to reshape that part of the world if Afghanistan is strengthening its ties with India?
I can jump in.
Sure.
The Pakistanis are not at all pleased with India's presence and attempts to cultivate, you know, more presence and more kind of influence within Afghanistan. They see that as their you know, part of their sphere of influence, and they've actually been periodically in the last few months, or actually over the year, Pakistan has been making representations privately to Washington to try to dissuade the Indians from, you know, trying to be more active, you know, within Afghanistan. Of course, there was an attack upon an Indian, I think the Indian embassy, a bombing attack that killed about, you know, 58 people, you know, just a few months ago.
Dr. Smith, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think you have to be careful of what you do when you ring a regime that's under pressure with perceived enemies. I mean, look at a map of Iran and where U.S. forces are vis-a-vis the Iranian state. It's pretty much everywhere we could possibly be without being in Iranian territory. And sure, that could exert some pressure and get them maybe to behave the way you want them to, but it can also make them retrench and be more recalcitrant and tougher to deal with. And I think whether we encourage a relationship between Afghanistan and India might best be looked at in how we see Pakistan reacting. Pakistan, you know, going back to our earlier conversation, there's more than just the direct war on terror where we have interest in Pakistan staying engaged. Between 1 in 9 and 1 in 10 of all UN peacekeeping forces around the world, in conflict spots around the world, they're Pakistani. Pakistan has long been the top contributor to these conflict zones where we don't want to send troops and other countries might not want to send troops. Pakistan sends them. They're pretty engaged in the international community in the fight against at least instability and conflict in other parts of the world, and we'd like them to stay engaged in those places as well.
Dr. Smith, perhaps you could talk about the legacy of bin Laden and that war in Idaho, since you in Moscow have a connection to this.
Right. Well, our state has an interesting role, right? If you go back to the early times of the war on terror, after the USA Patriot Act was passed, the first high-profile arrest was made here in Moscow of Sami Omar al-Hussein, who was a computer engineering student here, a computer science student, rather, from Saudi Arabia, and that trial took place in Boise. You all will remember that. And so it goes back to this idea in our state that the war on terrorism has never really been an esoteric thing. It's been a real thing, either through this sort of relationship we have here in Moscow or because our Idaho National Guard soldiers have been so engaged in the war on terrorism. I think the main message would be that this isn't something that just took place over there, that bin Laden didn't just have an impact in the United States generally the way maybe you say a natural disaster hits in New Orleans and it doesn't directly impact Idaho. And bin Laden hit in New York and it impacted Idaho in real ways.
Let's get to our next caller. Robert in Moscow.
Yeah,
Robert.
Hi, Robert. What do you think the likelihood is of a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan? Those people hate each other.
Actually, you could probably teach a whole course on that. Good question.
I hope it's very small.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just
Well,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Anderson. Let's go, Robert.
I was going to say that the leaderships of both countries are rational. They want to live. They want their wives and children to live. However much there's popular passions against between Pakistan and India, the leadership of both countries realized that nuclear exchange would be mutual suicide.
And that's the best thing we've had going for us ever since the nuclear era began.
Well, self-assured destruction.
Yeah. One hopes that that the same logic that prevented the United States and the Soviet Union from using those weapons, even at the deepest freeze of the Cold War, and the United States and the People's Republic of China would hold there as well.
Well, then let me ask the big question as we start running our time down for this show is, are we safer today than we were before bin Laden's death? Let's go with Dr. Anderson. Yeah.
Well, the problem we've had in the United States, when we're thinking about terrorism, we always focus on the last big attack. And so, the war on terror has almost been defined as the war against al-Qaeda and the war to hunt down, kill, or bring to justice bin Laden. Well, there are other enemies out there. One is Hezbollah. It's, here's one of the differences between al-Qaeda and Hezbollah is that before we went into Afghanistan, al-Qaeda had a good network organization. Then it had a territory, a sanctuary. Within it could have training camps, leadership, all kinds of support, logistical activities. And then in a sense it had state support. There was a weak Taliban government that essentially they were in alliance with. They lost two of those things. They lost the sanctuary, they lost what measure state support they had from that government. Hezbollah has a strong organization, developed very, very prodigiously ever since 1982. It has Iranian state sponsorship. It receives over $1.2 billion yearly in support from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it effectively controls a nation state within the Middle East. And effectively, Hezbollah is now in control of Lebanon. And Hezbollah has branches throughout the Lebanese diaspora, throughout the world, and conceivably, you know, they have not actively been attacking U.S. targets, you know, since the end of the hostage situation in Lebanon, 1993 or so. But if conflict were to break out between Israel and Iran, or there's armed conflict between the United States and Iran, the president of Iran has threatened to unleash, you know, Hezbollah International, their network of cells that they have throughout North and South America and also within Europe. And so that, in some ways, quantitatively, potentially, Hezbollah could pose a much greater threat than even the remnant al-Qaeda cells.
Dr. Smith.
Well, Sean, you depressed us all and gave us all that little bit of hope we had from getting bin Laden. But he's right. I wish there was a good answer to give the viewers. The short answer is no, we're not any safer. I would say, though, that we've ramped up our intelligence gathering capabilities so much in recent years. People asked whether we were at greater threat after bin Laden was dead from a retaliatory strike or something like that. Hey, our folks are aware of that possibility. They're paying attention, closer attention, and better attention than they would have several years ago. So I guess you can't catch all of them. That's one of the problems with this kind of struggle, but I think we're a lot more vigilant than we were before.
Al-Qaeda's off balance right now. And they're off balance not only because of losing bin Laden, but if you go back before his death, there were a series of dramatic events that occurred in Tunisia and Egypt and now in Libya and elsewhere in the Middle East. Al-Qaeda was caught flat-footed. They had historically made two arguments. One was the only way to bring about significant change in the Middle East was to attack the United States and weaken it so it would release its control over the so-called puppet authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And that then to get rid of those puppet regimes, you would have to use violence. Well, what we have seen is that there has been remarkable change and ongoing change without either of those two conditions being fulfilled. In that sense, the Al-Qaeda message was misplaced in terms of what actually has been transpiring in the Middle East.
So are we safer?
And they reacted poorly.
Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We will continue this discussion when we flip over onto our web extra. So I'd like to make sure we thank our guests in Moscow, Bill Smith, sir. Thank you very much. In Pocatello,
you're welcome.
Sean Anderson, thank you, sir. I appreciate you joining us.
Sure.
And in Boise, Greg Raymond, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
And if you want to learn more, feel free to go to the Dialogue website at idahoptv.org. You can also watch the Dialogue web extra that we'll tape right after this live show. Check it out there. I also invite you to become a friend on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Thanks for tuning in, and join us here next time for Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out